Hello and welcome. It's 10 a.m. on Friday, the 19th of September. You're tuned in to our mid-morning newscast here on ARIRANG TV. I'm Mark Broome. Let's take a look at what's making the headlines. The Incheon Asian Games officially kick off this evening with a grand opening ceremony. Thousands of athletes from more than 40 countries will be vying for 439 gold medals in 36 sports. The vote count in Scotland's independence referendum is well underway. The result is likely to be known in a few hours' time, but the latest exit poll from YouGov shows the no vote with an 8% lead. Plus, the US Senate approves the nomination of Mark Lippert as the new US ambassador to South Korea. He'll replace Sung Kim as the top US envoy to Seoul. But we start with the economic plans for next year. Sweeping increases in spending, higher taxes, and the money spent on welfare boosted by billions of dollars. These all key parts of the government's budget plan for 2015. Officials say the expansionary policies are essential to revitalize the economy, which has been stuck in a low-growth trap for months now. Hwang Ji-ae reports.
The Korean government on Thursday unveiled its biggest spending increase in 7 years for 2015, underlining its determination to get the nation's economy back on a normal growth track. In its new budget proposal, the finance ministry said it will raise spending by 5.7% from this year to 376 trillion won, or roughly 360 billion US dollars.
We raised spending by about $7.5 billion from our original plan. That's a massive rise considering the government's additional spending plans usually hovered around the $5 to $6 billion level in the past.
More than 30% of the 2015 budget will be spent on creating more jobs and improving welfare. It also calls for increasing expenditures in safety-related government projects like an overall inspection of safety facilities. The government aims to prevent large-scale accidents and disasters like April's ferry sinking from happening again. The proposal calls for a $32 billion budget deficit, which would represent 2.1% of the nation's GDP. But the ministry says by breathing fresh life into the sputtering economic recovery, the country would achieve fiscal balance within a few years.
The increased expenditure will result in a virtuous cycle, as it will lead to more income and robust business activities that will, in turn, generate greater tax revenues.
Korea's debt-to-GDP ratio is expected to inch up next year from this year, but the government says it still reflects Korea's relatively sound fiscal health. It says the mid-30% range is still much lower than the OECD average of around 110%. The increased spending plan is projected to help the economy grow by 4% next year. Hwang Ji-ae, Arirang News.
Now, Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan has ruled out raising taxes in order to cover the government's budget deficit, saying that such a move would hurt the economic recovery. In interviews with Korean TV networks KBS and SBS on Thursday, Choi highlighted the problems Japan has faced, arguing that the Japanese economy is still struggling after raising consumption taxes earlier this year. This despite its extremely aggressive quantitative easing policies. Choi did underscore the importance of managing the situation for the longer term, though, saying the country has to be prepared for a rainy day, citing the potential costs of reunification of the two Koreas and also the associated welfare costs related to the country's fast-aging population. Now, along with the additional spending, Korea's national debt is expected to hit a record high next year. The finance ministry says government debt will reach $546 billion in 2015, and that will account for nearly 36% of the country's gross domestic product. The government is also projected to log a $32 billion fiscal deficit just for next year, or a 2.1% of GDP, above its initial forecast of 1.7%. Now, the Agriculture Ministry announced on Thursday that tariffs on imported rice will be set at a staggering 513% to protect domestic farmers from cheap rice imports from the US and China. You'd think local farmers would be quite pleased with that result, but they are actually quite upset at the measure because they say there was no communication with them or transparency in the process at all. Our Ji Myung-gil reports.
The Korean government has set its tariff on rice imports at 513%. The Agriculture Ministry said the high tariff will help protect Korea's rice industry as imported rice will be more expensive.
We have prepared measures such as stabilizing the income of rice farmers, modernizing the rice farming industry, and promoting the consumption of rice.
Lawmakers from the ruling Saenuri Party also said imposing high tariffs was the only answer to help locally produced rice compete with the influx of imported rice on the market. The move comes as the country is set to liberalize its rice market from next year. However, farmers and civic groups oppose the move, saying it will hurt their livelihoods and the local rice market.
The government unilaterally declared a tariff rate without even discussing it with the farmers or the public. The whole process was done in secret.
The ministry said the proposed tariff rate will be submitted to the World Trade Organization before the end of this month. If the rate is confirmed by the WTO, the proposed tariff will go into effect on January 1st of 2015. However, it could be months until the process is finalized, while the WTO assesses whether the tariff rate proposed by Korea is appropriate. Korea had been allowed to delay the opening of its rice market under a WTO quota agreement in 1993, in exchange for gradually increasing its mandatory import quota, which reached more than 400,000 tons this year. The agreement with the WTO requires Korea to continue importing the mandatory quota even after the market is opened next year at a 5% tariff rate. The government could not afford to further postpone the opening of the rice market, nor had a reason to do so, as the country's rice consumption continues to drop. Ji Myung-gil, Arirang News.
Now, following the liberalization of the rice market, South Korea will now propose to use its imported rice to aid North Korea. Seoul's Agriculture Ministry said on Friday that the government plans to lift its limitation on the usage of rice under the so-called Minimum Market Access Agreement. This agreement sets the minimum amount of rice the market must import once it opens its market, and that was set at 30% before the market was liberalized. The South Korean government has thus far restricted the use of this rice to the domestic market only. Later this month, Seoul will submit the modified amendment to the World Trade Organization, which will then decide whether to grant South Korea approval to send the imported rice to North Korea.
And TGI Friday, everyone, as today marks the day when the 2014 Incheon Asian Games officially kicks off with the opening ceremony later today. But on Thursday, the flag-raising ceremony took place at the Athletes Village, welcoming everyone from the 45 nations competing in the Games. Now, as all 45 flags of the nations participating in the Asian Games were raised on Thursday, 50 South Korean officials were on hand, as the athletes themselves were still training in preparation for their competitions. But most of the attention went to the 30 or so North Korean athletes who were in attendance, as they remained tight-lipped in front of the reporters, but were visibly happy to be a part of the Games. Now, as soon as the competitions kick off, the fans will be looking forward to some of the biggest rivalries between some of the biggest names in Korean sports. And of course, first off, taking a look at swimming, Korea's Park Tae-hwan versus China's Sun Young will garner a ton of attention as the two Olympic swimmers are set to face off in the 200-meter, 400-meter, and the 1500-meter freestyle event. And of course, speaking of Korea-China rivalry over in rhythmic gymnastics, 20-year-old Son Yeon-jae hopes to win her first gold medal in the Asian Games, but China's Deng Sun-wei is expected to be her biggest rival. And of course, lastly, over in artistic gymnastics, London gold medalist Yang Ak-sun is expected to win a gold medal in Incheon, but quite a rivalry building up ahead of the Asian Games with North Korea's Lee Se-kwang, who also boasts a technique named after himself. Now, another name fans in Korea are going to be looking forward to is Jin Jong-ho over in the men's air pistol event. And while he holds world records in 10-meter and 50-meter air pistol and has won gold in the Olympics and the World Championships, he's still looking for his first individual gold in the Asian Games. And while he did win 2 gold medals during the 2010 Gwangju Asian Games, it was the 10-meter and the 50-meter air pistol team events, falling short in the 50-meter men's individual, winning a silver as the 34-year-old triple Olympic champion hopes to finally win that elusive individual gold. And now finishing things off in baseball, as the national team prepared for their first game against Thailand on the 22nd. They played an exhibition game against the LG Twins on Thursday night. Now, Hong Sung-moo, the only amateur player on the roster, taking the mound for the national team as he gives up 2 runs in 2 innings of pitching while striking out 4. And while the LG Twins took a 3-0 lead in the third, Na Sung-bum would hit a grand slam to give the national team the 4-3 lead, sparking the offense on the night. The national team will finish off with 15 hits in the game as they easily win their exhibition game 10-3. And that's going to wrap it up for me. Best of luck to all the athletes competing in the Asian Games. And with that said, this has been SJ. See you guys again for your sports needs.
Well, let's turn to some of the international headlines we're following on this Friday morning. And of course, the story of the day is the Scottish referendum. Voting has now wrapped up and the count begins. For this and other stories, we turn to our Eunice Kim, standing by at the news centre. Busy morning for you, Eunice.
Hello, Mark.
Yes, so the ballots have been cast, polls are now closed, and ballot counting is well underway.
Well underway indeed, as they are even brought in from the communities. We are getting word of results of the first district of 32 districts that has voted. Orkney district, with some 14,900 votes, has voted no to the referendum with 54%, and yes vote coming in at 46%. Of course, this is just the beginning of the vote counting. This, as the UK's cabinet minister for Scotland has said, there was a tremendous mix of emotions, of nerves, of apprehension and excitement as the past weeks of political intensity begins to wind down.
You know, the high turnout in this poll, if it is confirmed, is one of the positives. The engagement of people everywhere you go in Scotland for the last few weeks. This has been the one thing that people have been talking about, and with a tremendous degree of knowledge. You know, suddenly you've got a population that is not just expert in politics, they are expert in pollsters and the different methods of polling. You know, everybody has really got engaged.
A record turnout is anticipated for this historic vote, so far in the 80% range, as a steady stream of decision makers walked in and out of the more than 5,500 polling stations Thursday. Now, from Scotland's Highlands to its hundreds of islands, people voted. An unprecedented 97% of the electorate, you'll remember, had registered to vote. That's some 4.3 million people. And among them, for the first time, were 16 and 17-year-olds given the right to partake as well. Meanwhile, the first survey out since the votes closed by YouGov had found that those against independence were leading by 8 points. Full results are expected by breakfast time in Scotland or in the afternoon here in Korea. U.S. warplanes have struck an Islamic State training camp in Iraq, marking their first attack not directly supporting local forces. A U.S. military officer told the AFP that some 40 jihadist militants were on the ground at the time of the strike, with a second air raid hitting an IS ammunition depot southeast of Baghdad. This as France has indicated it is ready to join in the air fight in Iraq. Meanwhile, IS militants posted another video featuring a Western hostage. It showed British journalist John Cantley delivering their propaganda and did not show a beheading, unlike videos before it. In Nigeria, Boko Haram militants have overtaken 25 towns and villages. This according to a Catholic bishop in the region who submitted a list of those areas, warning that the jihadists were carving out an Islamic State in northeastern Nigeria. He said their flags were flying in Borno, Yobe, and other parts of Adamawa states, driving priests there to take refuge. He said a huge humanitarian crisis was unfolding with resources from the state government limited. And the UN Security Council has announced a new mission to fight back the worsening Ebola epidemic in West Africa after declaring it a threat to international peace and security. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who said a 20-fold increase in assistance is needed, added a team will be on the ground by the end of the month. This as the number of people confirmed killed by the hemorrhagic virus surpassed 2,600. The U.S. has committed 3,000 troops and 17 treatment centers. France has said it will build a military hospital, while Cuba, China, Britain, and others have pledged medical workers and other forms of support.
Get connected to Korea and the world. Join us every weekday for the latest developments out of Korea, Asia, and beyond. On air, on your mobile, and online, we lead the way every day. ARIRANG News.
To try and resolve the crisis in Ukraine, the European Union also offers $15 billion. Now, it's taken a while, but it's confirmed South Korea will have a new U.S. ambassador soon after senators approved Mark Lippert as the next top U.S. envoy to Seoul. Lippert, chief of staff to Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, was nominated in early May to replace Sung Kim. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee approved Lippert's nomination in late June, but his nomination had been stuck in the Senate along with dozens of other ambassadors-to-be. His confirmation came despite opposition from Republicans who said Lippert, who's a close friend to President Barack Obama, was a political nominee. President Park Geun-hye makes her diplomatic debut at the United Nations next week, addressing the General Assembly for the first time since taking office early last year. While her speech has yet to be finalized, the president is widely expected to lay out the details of her vision for unification of the peninsula and seek international support for the plan. President Park will also likely talk about rebuilding inter-Korean trust while touching on the human rights situation in the north. For the first time, a ministerial level meeting on North Korea's human rights abuses will be held on the sidelines of the assembly, which will be attended by the top diplomats from the US, South Korea and Japan, as well as a number of other European countries. North Korea's state-run Korean Central News Agency has detailed the recent European tour made by Pyongyang's Secretary for International Affairs, Kang Seok-ju. In a report Thursday, it said Kang had met with 20 or so senior European officials, including some members of the European Parliament. This showing his 9-day trip to Germany, Belgium, Switzerland and Italy. The high-ranking North Korean diplomat is said to have held talks on ways to improve relations with each of those countries. Experts say Kang's trip indicates that the North is making efforts, at least to try and break out of its international isolation. Back here in South Korea, and ballooning household debt and high youth unemployment have been identified as the main causes for the considerable drop in private consumption here in the nation. Our Connie Kim reports on how efforts to try and turn the tide have thus far proven unsuccessful.
Increasing household debt and the lackluster youth employment rate are to blame for Korea's sluggish private consumption. That's the diagnosis by the Federation of Korean Industries in a recent report. The shrinking spending capacity of households was pinpointed as the biggest problem limiting consumption. The level of household debt last year stood at nearly $980 billion, which represents more than 70% of the nation's GDP. Now that's up about 20 percentage points from a decade ago. The increase in non-living expenditures such as taxes and insurance is also holding households back from spending. Non-living expenditures grew more than 70% last year from 10 years earlier, with household income increasing far less at less than 60%. Low youth employment was another troubling factor. While more than 400,000 new jobs were created last year, new positions for those in their 20s dropped by 80,000, while those for people in their 50s rose more than 200,000. Rising home rental prices, medical expenses, and difficulties in preparing for life after retirement were also cited in the report as reasons for Korea's sluggish private consumption. Officials at the Federation of Korean Industries say it's important to increase investment, which would generate employment and in turn lead to a boost in consumption. The Federation also called for measures that could induce corporate investment. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
Now, Korea has become one of the most visited countries by Chinese tourists, and with China's National Day holiday just around the corner now, a record number of visitors are expected to fly across the West Sea for the Golden Week. Our Kim Min-ji has this report.
China's week-long National Day holiday kicks off on October 1st this year. Around 160,000 Chinese tourists are expected to flock to Seoul, up 35% from the same period a year ago. Nearly 8 million foreign tourists visited the country this year as of July, and about 3.4 million, or 4 in every 10 foreign visitors, were Chinese. And it's a trend that's likely to continue. The total number of Chinese visitors is expected to reach 5 million next month and 6 million by the end of the year. Will they open their wallets? Chinese people are much wealthier than they used to be, with their gross national income per capita standing at around $6,700 last year. And they aren't shy about spending while they're here either.
Chinese tourists tend to spend more during special occasions. In the case of the national holiday, they're expected to shell out nearly $3,000 each.
It's estimated that Chinese tourists will spend over $400 million during the holiday week alone. But the increased spending doesn't necessarily go into the pockets of Korea.
Many visitors arrange their visits through Chinese travel agencies or dwell in Chinese-operated hotels, so a significant portion of the profits actually go back to China.
He added that to prevent such a phenomenon, Korea needs to develop its tourism infrastructure, for instance by providing more language assistance and making it more convenient for Chinese tourists while they are here. Kim Min-ji, ARIRANG News.
delightful autumn day is in store today, and thin layers of clouds in the southern coast region should gradually move out from the nation, but Jeju Island should receive on and off showers throughout the day. And unlike chilly morning lows, highs will rise to the warm side. It will be warmer than yesterday, which means we'll experience a big temperature difference between lows and highs, so please dress accordingly. And let's take a closer look at the readings for today. The afternoon high in Seoul, Daegu and Gwangju will all rise to 28, while Busan will peak at 26 this afternoon. Now for other regions, it looks like down on Jeju Island and Daejeon should see highs of 24 and 27 respectively, while Dokdo should top out at 23. Now the opening ceremony for the Asian Games will kick off in Incheon this evening at 6 p.m. and the weather should be pleasant during the day, but if you plan to watch the ceremony at the site, be sure to dress warmly. And the weather should be pleasant through the weekend, and not only here in Seoul, but in other many areas. So hope you get to enjoy the nice weather conditions over the weekend. Now that's all for Korea, and here's international weather for viewers around the world.
Well, those are the stories we have for you at this hour. For more of the latest stories, don't forget to check out our website, arirang.co.kr/news. Enjoy your weekend. Goodbye.